This is the first of 4 lecture videos that go with the Conservation and Biodiversity module. So I've divided this module into 4 topics: the origin of biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity, threats, and then the preservation of biodiversity. So I'm going to start out with origins. So your learning objectives for this section are to describe the characteristics of the organisms in the domains bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. You need to understand the process that results in adaptation and evolution of a population, describe the 3 requirements for natural selection, and then I want you to be able to apply these concepts or requirements for natural selection to a scenario when I give it to you in your assignment. So I wanted to start this with a quote by E.O. Wilson. He recently passed, but he is a well-known biologist, naturalist, and writer. He's known for writing books that appeal to the general public, but introduce these concepts of biodiversity and natural selection. So he wrote, "Biodiversity is our most valuable but least appreciated resource." So let's start the conversation by looking at the origins of biodiversity. So first of all, when we talk about diversity, you need to understand that when we look at all these different organisms on Earth, we classify them into groups. And this is what we call collectively taxonomy. So taxonomists name and group organisms, and we use genetics and morphology or physical appearance to do this. So what I have on the right here are all the different categorizations that organisms fit into. Now, I wrote here, looking at the picture, which category is the most inclusive or general, and which is the most exclusive or specific. So think of inclusive like you're including things. So the most general categorization is a domain. So like I told you, there are 3 domains that we recognize: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. All of the living organisms that we know of are in one of those 3 domains. So they are the most general. Now, as you go to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, you get more and more specific in that into the classification. So species is the most exclusive, right? A species is specific to a certain organism. So in the picture here, I'm showing you a domestic dog. So it's Canis lupus. Now, familiaris is actually like a subspecies, but for the most part, we call it Canis familiaris for the species. Don't worry about subspecies. I want you just to know that species refers to a specific organism. Okay, so this is showing you the 3 domains that we recognize. So like I said before, it's bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Now, all bacteria are unicellular, meaning they have 1 cell, and they are autotrophs or heterotrophs. Now, we've gone through the definitions of autotroph and heterotroph before, but I'm going to write them down here to remind you. Now, remember, autotroph usually refers to plants, but it can also refer to some bacteria, and it means an organism that produces its own food, usually through photosynthesis, but it can also be through the use of inorganic chemicals or chemicals that do not include carbon. So autotroph produces its own food through photosynthesis, and I'm just going to write the term here, chemosynthesis. That just means using inorganic chemicals to produce sugar. When we say produce its own food, we are talking about sugar. Now, hopefully you remember that a heterotroph is an organism that must consume other organisms for food. So humans are heterotrophs. We don't photosynthesize. So must consume other organisms for food. Okay, so bacteria, for the most part, are heterotrophs, but there is a very important group of bacteria called cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. It's not really an algae, it's a bacterium, but these were the first organisms on Earth to produce oxygen. And they are what created the oxygen in our atmosphere and allowed the evolution of multicellular life. Now, for an organism to have more than one cell, it has to be able to transport oxygen throughout all of the cells. And so before there was oxygen in the atmosphere, organisms were only unicellular. The next domain is archaea. These are also unicellular. They look a little bit like bacteria, but they're actually more closely related to eukarya or animals than they are to bacteria. Now, they are one cell, like I said, and they're called extremophiles, meaning that they live in very extreme environments like hydrothermal vents or very acidic, like the geysers and things like that in Yellowstone or salt ponds. So you will find archaea in all of these very extreme environments. But we also have archaea that live in and on our bodies, as well as bacteria and fungi. All kinds of organisms live in and on your body. Now, our third domain is eukarya. That includes plants, animals, fungi, and a group we call protists. Now, notice that I wrote unicellular and multicellular. So there's often a misconception that in the domain eukarya, you have all multicellular organisms or organisms with many different kinds of cells. But protists, most protists are unicellular, but they are still eukaryotes. So I'm talking about things like amoeba or paramecium. All of these are single-celled protists. So these are the three domains that you need to know. And when I say that you need to know the characteristics, for instance, you need to know that bacteria are unicellular, autotrophs are heterotrophs. You need to know that archaea are unicellular and the different types of environments that they can live in. And you need to know which groups are part of eukarya and that they are unicellular and multicellular. Now, I put this image in the PowerPoint because what I want you to recognize here is that little green marker here and that little segment between the lines, those are eukaryotes, right? All of the plants, animals, fungi, and protists fit into that little area. And so if you look at this image, you can see that bacteria are far more diverse than all of eukaryotes put together, meaning that we have so many species of bacteria that it outnumbers all the species we have together in plants, animal, fungi, and protists. So bacteria are absolutely essential to life on Earth. In fact, we have bacteria in our oceans, thousands of bacterial species. We have bacteria in our soil. It's everywhere. So let's move on to evolution. So evolution is also called descent with modification. So on my slide, I ask you what this means and how do new species evolve from a common ancestor? So if you look at my image here, go back to the beginning and it says prokaryotes, cells without nuclei. Well, prokaryotes mean bacteria and archaea, and they were the first living organisms on Earth. Now, keep in mind that even bacteria and archaea came from the original cell. So descent with modification refers to the fact that we all come from a common ancestor, that original cell. And over billions of years, all of the different types of life you see on Earth evolved from that original cell. And there are different ways that we know this because we all share certain characteristics. Like, for instance, all living organisms have DNA. And that is because DNA is a highly efficient molecule for transmitting genetic information. And DNA evolved in that original living cell, and it's never changed throughout all of these billions of years, the history of life on Earth. I mean, it's changed in that genes have developed or genes have been taken out of our DNA, but we all have DNA that carries genetic information. So descent with modification means that you start with a common ancestor, and through the process of evolution, including natural selection, you get a variety of species. So let me write down a definition for you here. Then this box here. Okay, so descent with modification. Multiple species arise from a common ancestor through the process of evolution by means of natural selection. I wrote in other processes, I mean other methods of evolution. Trying to get rid of this box. Nope. Okay, so we are going to talk about evolution by means of natural selection. And like I said, there are other processes that lead to evolution, but natural selection is the only process that results in adaptation, in organisms looking like they are made for a certain environment. The other types of evolution, which we call like genetic drift and gene flow, things like that, those do not result in adaptation. And I'm not going to introduce those concepts now. We're just going to talk about natural selection. I want you to remember what is written on this slide. Evolution occurs when there is a change in the frequency of a gene in a population over many generations. Now, that may not make sense right at this point, but I'm going to show you a couple examples, and I have also put a very good video in this PowerPoint, which I'll have you watch on your own. So the origin of natural selection, or coming up with the theory of natural selection, theory of evolution, we often credit only Charles Darwin for writing about natural selection, but it was also a joint effort by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. But when they both came up with natural selection, Wallace allowed Charles Darwin to go forward and present this concept because Darwin had already compiled his notes and written about it, whereas Wallace hadn't actually written a book on it like Darwin had. Well, they presented first at a scientific conference, but Wallace deferred and let Darwin do it. That is why we mostly only hear about natural selection in relation to Charles Darwin. Now, both of these scientists traveled throughout the world collecting organisms and looking at variation in these organisms. As you may have heard, Charles Darwin sailed around the world on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He went and sailed around the Horn of Africa and ended up in the Galapagos Islands, where he made many, many observations and collections on all kinds of organisms, but he is well known for looking at finches on the different Galapagos Islands in the archipelago. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace, he studied insects and a bunch of other types of organisms in Brazil and the Malay archipelago, meaning like a series of islands. And it was looking at variation in organisms that are very, very similar that allowed these scientists to come up with the theory of natural selection. So here is the Amoeba Sister video. I think it's a really great video. It provides good examples and kind of takes the whole concept down to the key points that I want you to know about. So I strongly urge you to watch this on your own time. So let's look at an example of natural selection. So first of all, there are several requirements for natural selection to occur. But before I start with that, there are a few pieces of information I want you to keep in mind. So natural selection and evolution occur to a population of organisms of the same species. Now I'm going to elaborate on that in a second, but when I say a population, you should know what a population is. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species located in the same area. Could be like a habitat or a region, whatever area you happen to be talking about. So I can talk about, say, a population of coyotes in the Sonoran Desert, right? So when we are talking about natural selection and eventual evolution and adaptation, I am talking about a group of organisms. Now you can talk about micro and macro evolution, micro meaning the changing of characteristics in a population, or you can talk about macro evolution, which is the formation of new species. And they are very closely related. Microevolution may or may not lead to macroevolution. Okay, now let me talk about a couple other things before I start on this example. Now, I said that natural selection and evolution, they occur within a population, but what I want you to realize is natural selection applies to the individual organism, okay? Whereas evolution occurs to a population. So let me explain what I mean by this. So if you have, like my picture, brown beetles and green beetles, and let's say the green beetles do not blend into the environment, so birds eat them. The birds are considered the agent of selection, right? That's the predator. That is the factor that is weeding out green beetles and brown beetles. So that bird is eating individual beetles, right? Natural selection is occurring to the individual beetles. They're being eaten, and it depends on whether they are green or brown. Now, evolution and adaptation occur to a population. So if you look at my picture, the brown beetles blend in well to the bark. That's what you may call an adaptation, but a beetle does not change throughout its lifetime, right? You cannot go from being a brown beetle or a green beetle to a brown beetle. That's just not possible. So evolution and adaptation occur to a population as all the green beetles die and the brown beetles take over. That is evolution. Okay, so let me expand on that with the example. So I mentioned that there are several requirements for natural selection to occur. The first of those being that there is variation in traits. The trait of exoskeleton cover, I was trying to think of an easier word for it, the color of the beetle, right? That is the trait, beetle color. Some beetles are green and some beetles are brown. Okay, so all beetles have the gene for shell color, but some beetles have a variation that gives you brown color and some beetles have a variation that gives you green color. So I'm going to write that here. Okay, so all beetles have some gene for shell color. It's just that some have the version that gives you green shells and some have the version that gives you brown. Okay, but that is what I mean by a variation in traits. Now, when you are looking at a variation in a trait, it has to be a variation that is coded for by genetics. It has to be heritable. So okay, there are some insects that if they eat a certain part of a plant when they're a larvae, like a caterpillar, they'll look one way. If they eat a different part of the plant, they'll look a different way because of the chemicals in the plant. That is not heritable. That is a difference in characteristics that comes from where they feed on the plant. It is not passed down from parent to offspring. So for natural selection, that variation has to be passed down from parent to offspring. Now, the next requirement is that there is differential reproduction. So no environment can support an unlimited number of individuals, right? All environments have limited resources at some level, even the environments that sustain humans. So even when you're looking at Earth as a whole and how many humans it can support, it is limited. We're not sure how limited, but we know there is a limit. So looking at beetles, there cannot be an infinite number of beetles in a habitat, right? There's a limit. So some of the beetles do not get to reproduce to their full potential. So the beetles that are better at surviving will produce more offspring. So as I wrote here, green beetles tend to get eaten by birds, so they do not survive as long as the brown beetles. So therefore, they do not produce as many offspring. So what we have here, differential reproduction, differential, think of it like difference. There's a difference in reproduction. Brown beetles produce a lot of offspring because they live longer. Green beetles produce fewer offspring because they're being eaten. Now, heredity, this is kind of what I mentioned in my previous slide. So the variation in the trait has to be heritable. Now, it's taking it a step further with my image here. So the surviving beetles, most of which are brown, have offspring of the same color because it has a genetic basis, right? Being brown when you're a beetle is determined by the gene version that you have. So if you have mostly brown beetles that are reproducing, most of the offspring are going to be brown as well. So the end result is that this advantageous trait, which is being brown because you blend into the bark on the trees, it allows brown beetles to survive longer and produce more offspring. Brown beetles become more common in the population, and over many, many generations, all the individuals will eventually be brown. Okay, so these are the requirements for natural selection. And this is how natural selection works. And I'm going to write this down because this is really important that you remember this. So okay, natural selection is the only type of evolution that results in adaptation. Other types of evolution are random. Okay, they, like for instance, genetic drift. You have a population of beetles, most of them are killed, so the beetles that are remaining kind of set the genetics for generations to come. Okay, but natural selection is the only type of evolution that gives you adaptation. And you can see natural selection and evolution today, right? You don't have to wait for billions of years. Just think about bacteria. You take antibiotics, you kill off most of the bacteria that are susceptible to the antibiotic, leaving a few of the bacteria that are immune. They reproduce and reproduce until eventually the entire population of bacteria that remains is immune to the antibiotic. It's antibiotic resistance. And things like using antibiotics too much in our population or taking most of your antibiotics, but not all of them, leads to antibiotic resistance. So the last part of this first section is to test your understanding. So I give you a scenario, beetles on a diet versus beetles of a different color. And you need to decide which scenario is representative of natural selection. So I'm going to let you do this on your own. Whoops. I'm going to let you do this on your own. And if you have any questions, make sure that you reach out to me so we can talk about anything that you don't understand. So the next lecture video will be on the importance of biodiversity.